Now I get to introduce my friend and longtime colleague, Alice Conklin, who is the distinguished professor of history at Ohio State. Alice began with a book called A Mission to Civilize, the Republican Idea of Empire in France in West Africa. That won the Berkshire Prize. She followed that up with In the Museum of Man, Race, Anthropology, and Empire in France, 1850 to 1950. That won the Pinckney Prize and was translated and illustrated as Exposé l'Humanité, Race, Ethnologie et Empire en France. And that came out in 2015. She's co-authored books that we all know and use, France and its Empire since 1870 with Sarah Fishman and Robert Zaretsky, and European Imperialism, Climax and Contradictions with Ian Fletcher, and countless articles. She's working on a book now about the transnational history of anti-racism, which is tentatively called Anti-Racism at UNESCO. We're really delighted that she was able to be here this afternoon. She's a big deal, and we are honored to host her and hear her talk with Aro about his book. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Judy. You were supposed to be short, and that was way too long and way too generous, but thank you. And thank you for your remarks, which we all feel that this is a very difficult moment. And it's also sunny just about wherever we four are. So thank you, everybody, for attending. So Aro Velmet is an assistant professor at USC and a visiting researcher at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He received his PhD from NYU and then held a European Commission Marie Curie postdoc at Oxford, which only seems fitting in his global reach. His research interests are in the history of science, technology, and medicine, history of empires, and gender history. He's currently working on the history of standardizing vaccination campaigns in the post-war era and a history of the Soviet and post-Soviet information age. Incredibly relevant. So Aro is going to make some comments about his book, and then I will follow up with a few more comments. And then finally, we'll turn to you, our audience. Aro, I'm going to let you talk now.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice, and thanks, Sally and Judith, for organizing this. And I can only echo all of your sentiments about, the difficult times we're in, and I'm happy to see people here, and I hope this is a welcome distraction from some very dark times indeed. Thank you, Alice, for agreeing to comment on the book. It's hard for me to think of a better reader for this, and I know you've been a supporter of this project since the very early days when I first wrote to you as an incoming graduate student at NYU, being a huge fan of your work. So I'm really happy to have this meeting here. I'm going to try to be brief and just introduce a couple of the themes of the book and then hand it over to Alice. Pasteur's Empire is a book about the relationship between biomedicine and imperialism in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. I take as my central object of analysis the network of Pasteur Institutes, these biomedical research laboratories that started in France and then extended to France's colonies in Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. But it's really a global story that tries to account for developments that took place in the hospitals of British Hong Kong, in laboratories in Nha Trang, Vietnam, in voluntary associations among Vietnamese and African activists in various places around the world, in international organizations in Geneva and in laboratories in New York. So even in some ways, this is a story about the Francophone Empire, but in other ways, it's also a story about the history of global biomedicine. And one of the reasons why this story is so intriguing to me is because of how microbiology and the history of microbiology has thus far been seen as quite distinct from the history of the French colonial state. And one way this is expressed, or one place where I noticed this, was when I was doing archival research in Ho Chi Minh City, back in the day, Saigon, and saw how, all the street names in Ho Chi Minh City are in Vietnamese, having been changed from the French street names after World War II. But there are three exceptions. If you walk around for long enough, you run across streets named after Pasteur, Albert Calmette, and Alexandre Yersin, the two microbiologists who made their careers in colonial Indochina, in present-day Vietnam. So that struck me as kind of a good metaphor for this relationship that the Pasteur Institutes have to the post-colonial world today. It's this kind of sense that whatever else the colonial state was doing in Africa and in Indochina, the Pasteur Institutes were a good thing. They were providing vaccinations, healthcare, scientific knowledge, and were separate from the rest of the whole story. So I was interested in, how did the story actually look if you look at it from the perspective of the late 19th century? It turns out to be quite a different story indeed. So in the book, I sort of make four claims that relate to different historiography. And the first one is to argue that bacteriology, rather than being something that set apart from the French colonial state, was actually a central part of the French civilizing mission. It was one of these humanitarian claims that the French state was attaching its colonial activities to. I think a lot of us here might know Hubert Lyautey's sort of famous line that a doctor is worth a battalion. But in the case of the Pasteur Institute, this really was how the French state thought about it. If you look at the French colonial exposition of 1931, and then the Pasteur Institutes occupy a central space. So one intervention is to simply show the close connection between these two entities, the Pasteur Institute being formally independent, but nevertheless occupying a privileged space because of this connection to the civilizing mission. And this had consequences for both the microbiologist and the state itself. It allowed the Pasteur Institute to use their outposts in the colonies to pursue projects that would not be possible elsewhere because of this close relationship they had to colonial administrators. Second, I argue that the history of historian biomedicine forces us to rethink the relationship between biomedicine and colonialism more broadly. There's a way in which we tend to think about biomedicine in the colonies as a kind of Foucauldian channel of power, right? In a way through which control over colonial bodies was extended and deepened, through which distinctions between colonizers and colonized were instantiated and replicated. So we can think of Warwick Anderson's evocation of biomedical citizenship, right, as a kind of way of describing this relationship. And one of the interesting things about the Pasteur Institutes is that that's not really the kind of relationship that's operating there. The Pasteur Institutes and their biomedical work, in particular the development of vaccines and disinfection procedures, generally did not work to expand state power over various parts of colonial society. Rather, it was a discourse through which state power could be limited, because historian biomedicine operated alongside and sometimes in tension with ideas about, different terms to call it, but we could say something like social medicine, right, or social hygiene. Modes of medical intervention that focused on things like building infrastructure, putting in place sewage systems, improving nutrition, thinking about people's moral behavior, that really was quite expansive in its scope. And something that France had a long history of practicing in the 19th century, and something that many Vietnamese and African activists and doctors were demanding that the French actually practice, right? Like if you're coming to Saigon, then the least you could do is build some sewers, or put in place dispensaries and sanatoria for people who are suffering from tuberculosis, the same way you've done in France. But the language of Pastorian biomedicine, this language that focused not on the social and environmental context of disease etiology, disease generation, but focused simply on the pathogenic microbe and how to keep it away from the human body, was a much more limited affair. The Pastorians were saying, in essence, it doesn't really matter whether you're working in Saigon or Dakar or France. You don't need to know anything about the people who live there, their customs, their history, their habits, their hygienic practices. All you need to know is what microbe is causing trouble, and we can give you the vaccine to solve it. And that was a much more focused way of intervening in colonial society, and a much cheaper way of intervening in colonial society. And if we think of new imperial history and the work that Alice has done, among others, that shows how difficult it was to maintain political stability and run an empire on a shoestring, then this approach was really very appealing for colonial administrators. The third intervention is to argue that colonialism in turn shaped the development of microbiology in a number of ways. It sort of lifted up this kind of magic bullet-like approach to microbiological interventions, but it also provided spaces where microbiologists could move their projects in order to maneuver around different kinds of problems that they encountered in one place or another. And this is not just moving between metropole and colony. This is moving between different colonies in different empires, where, in one place you might have the laboratories that are powerful enough to do the kind of work that you need. A different place might have space for human trials, and a third space might have enough sort of well-developed état civil that you can actually keep track of your test subject. Finally, I argue that this is a story that doesn't just include administrators and scientists, elites working in laboratories and in the halls of the League of Nations Health Organization in Geneva, or the Assemblée Nationale. The language of biomedicine was taken up by Vietnamese and African actors, by student activists, and by doctors who made strategic alliances in order to claim new kinds of rights and make new kinds of demands on the colonial state. This question at the heart of the Pastorian project essentially was, how far does biomedicine extend? Do labor rights contain themselves a medical question? Do the rights of free association, are these a medical problem? And for some actors, for social hygienists, and for many Vietnamese doctors, the answer was yes. You need voluntary associations to raise awareness about tuberculosis, to provide public education for adults and children alike. For Pastorians, the answer was no. medicine is something that's done with a syringe, that's done by teams of vaccinators. So the book also traces these conflicts and looks at how not just Western trained doctors and scientists, but also activists and Vietnamese doctors and local notables engaged with this language of biomedicine in order to expand or push back against decisions made by administrators and the Pasteur. So this is very briefly the large interventions that the book's trying to make, but I'm now really interested to hear how Alice read this. So once again, thank you all for coming, and thanks for the invitation, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Aro. You know, when I was reading this book again, I kept seeing the hand I thought of, not myself, I'm not being vain, but of Fred Cooper, your advisor. And so when we're doing intellectual genealogies, you know, I am a big fan of Fred's work, and I met Fred back in the archives when I was a grad student, though, you know, then we kind of went separate ways. So it's just, anyway, a pleasure to see how these things bear such rich fruit. So it really is a pleasure to comment on your book today, Pasteur's Empire, Bacteriology and Politics in France, Its Colonies, and the World. Obviously, Pasteur's Empire is more timely than Aro could have possibly imagined when he started this project. It's a book about the outsized techno-political role played by a small group of microbiologists known as the Pasteurians in the management of disease in the French Empire from roughly the 1890s through the 1930s, what we often refer to as a period of high colonialism. Now, if this sounds a bit too medical and biological, a book too much about microbes, let me assure everyone of three things from the outset. First, Aro's cast of characters, as I think he just made clear, includes competing human, technological, and microbial actors, and he chronicles their competition in lively and accessible prose. This book scintillates with engrossing anecdotes, made all the more relevant given what we have collectively gone through these past 2 years and really continue to go through. Second, and equally important in a field well tilled by historians of medicine, Aro has beautifully synthesized the work on Pasteur and pasteurization while presenting his own exciting new research. This is a book any historian can enjoy, regardless of field. And third, this is so much more than a history of the Pasteur Institutes and of the men that ran them. Across 7 compact chapters, Aro tests what we think we know about biopolitics and imperial governance, about French ideas of civilizational superiority and the political and cultural violence they helped produce, about the circulation of ideas and practice between metropole and colony, with impacts in both directions and beyond those boundaries, about the so-called colonial laboratory, and finally about the limits of imperial power. And I don't know why I'm saying finally, because there are many other debates engaged. Now, it's a well-established fact that French colonial ideas and policies and realms as different as education, healthcare, infrastructure, forced labor shifted over time. This was due to political pushback from the colonized, to unintended consequences of initiatives that French administrators neither anticipated nor controlled, and to changing local, national, and international contexts. Aro deepens and complicates our understanding of these dynamics in a rare empire-wide case study of the place that medicine, public health, I'm not even sure what to call it anymore, held in both the colonial and metropolitan imaginary, but also in the government of colonies. And he ends with some very compelling insights into how global health in our neoliberal present is very much the grandchild of the unevenly networked and imperial research laboratories set up in the early 20th century by the French. Another reason why his study is so important. Rather than try to summarize this really broad-ranging and excellent book, and I'd like to address three areas or three dimensions of the argument that I found particularly intriguing. You can tell I'm a French historian because I do things in threes. One of Aro's principal arguments first is that bacteriology, and particularly colonial bacteriology, was an imperial civilizing project that became a mobile form of government. Power, politics, and mobility are central to the analysis as he tracks Pastorians from one Pasteur Institute to another. He maintains that as a form of government forged in the particular circumstances of the French Empire, where no public monies were forthcoming for funding any of France's ostensibly civilizing measures, bacteriologists adapted themselves quite happily to the different playing field they discovered overseas compared to that left behind in France. In the metropole, the new students of Pasteur had to share their professional terrain with social hygienists who had been managing public sanitation for most of the 19th century. These earlier reformers, as Aro just told you, had worked out certain protocols: sewers, clean water, clean homes, clean bodies, well before vaccination arrived on the scene. These same reformers continued to monopolize power and promote social hygiene measures in France after Pasteur. In the colonies, on the other hand, and this is one of Aro's most innovative findings, bacteriologists found that colonial administrators were happy to skip expensive and intrusive sanitary measures on behalf of colonial subjects and to support the low-cost efforts of the mostly self-financing Pastorians instead. And there is an important argument in this book about capitalism and biomedicine as well. Now, the Pastorians had, of course, a key advantage in the colonial context where outbreaks of disease like the plague and yellow fever endangered white lives. By promising to develop vaccinations against such scourges, the Pastorians had a magic bullet to sell to imperial legislators that enhanced their appeal. Given the opportunity to perform French scientific superiority to an audience of Africans and Asians, Pastorians, and here I quote Aro, argued for the primacy of the human microbe interaction and turned to microbiological technology, principally vaccines, sera, and ferments as their primary mode of intervention. So preventing infection rather than improving social conditions was always their preferred method. Now, if that were all there were to Aro's story, it wouldn't be as new and as riveting as it is. But Aro was serious when he put politics in his title. There's no such thing as a free playing field, even in colonial situations. Imperial projects had to rely on unreliable human actors and interests every step of the way. In the case of the Pastorians, they ran into interference from administrators, businessmen, colonial subjects, and international scientific bodies, but also more materially, microbes, vaccines, syringes, lab animals, and human test subjects. And Aro tracks all of these other actors and their interactions with Pastorians at particular moments in particular places. So, and first noteworthy feature of this book is that politics are front and central, and these politics are arranged in an impressive range of places. This brings me to a second remark. The book is really a tour de force in terms of organization. Aro adopts the concept of scales, and I've learned that historians of science think in terms of scales, almost always, but the concept of scale helps them get a handle on a topic which otherwise would be almost impossible to manage. Rather than providing potted biographies of these self-styled heroes of empire, Aro focuses on scientists' movement between multiple centers of calculation in order to convince us that at its core, modern imperial governance, at least in its scientific medical dimensions, was nodal. And that's my word, not Aro, so don't blame him if you don't like it. In other words, in keeping with current trends that focus on mobility, networks, and the circulation of knowledge, Aro takes us away from the notion of an imperial hub, let's call it Paris, with spokes radiating outwards from it to individual colonies. His story of the coalition between Pastorians and the colonial administration on the one hand, and international bodies such as the League of Nations Health Office, Rockefeller Foundation on the other. This story begins in Saigon, tracks back to Paris, moves on to an empire-wide TB prevention campaign, followed by deeply flawed trials of the BCG and yellow fever vaccines in Tunisia, Algeria, and sub-Saharan Africa. It's quite a range. The third aspect of the book that struck me was Aro's argument about Pastorian legacies today. And perhaps Aro sort of called his books, I don't know if you considered this, borrowing from Hochschild, Pasteur's ghost, since he concludes that this legacy seems to be everywhere in the world and not in a good way. Pastorians have an outsized reputation in France and the post-colonial world alike. Yet what colonial subjects wanted was medical care in the fullest sense, not magic bullets delivered only when epidemics arose. Only in the short period of developmental colonialism between 1945 and roughly the 1970s did the French administration, the UN, the World Health Organization tackle malnutrition and other questions of social medicine. In other words, make the provision of primary care the objective in the global South. These late in the day efforts were flawed and colonialist, definitely, but arguably they were better than what since the 1990s has replaced them. To quote Aro, today's regime of global health, whether targeting malaria or trying out new wonder drugs, is accompanied by a rhetoric of acute danger requiring immediate action. Result short-term, spectacular mitigation of a single problem, Ebola or AIDS, but exacerbation of global health inequality. Dying of malaria may be less common today, but dying of malnutrition has increased. So in terms of questions for Aro, I have a long list, but I'm just going to give you three, and I'm going to encourage other people to start thinking about sending questions to me in the chat. So a first question for you, Aro, is in the year of COVID, what is often euphemistically called vaccine hesitancy has made it the headlines over and over. And I was struck how little hesitancy you seem to document among those who are on the receiving end of vaccinations. You certainly stress the fact that Pastorians and administrators cared little about the behavior and bodily practices of Africans or Vietnamese. They aim to manage microbes, not people or spaces. But what kind of hesitancy did Africans and the Vietnamese actually exhibit? How much coercion was involved in the intimate bodily act of inoculation in a colonial setting? That's one question. A second question is, I've emphasized the place of politics in your argument, and you don't actually end with the dismal neoliberal turn of the last 20 to 30 years. Rather, you conclude by emphasizing that politics, and more particularly the politics of resistance, matter centrally. Historians might have imagined the empire as a single bounded and uniform space, but in fact, people, microbes, and technology collided constantly, generating new forms of opposition, as well as new forms of power. In this spirit, I found the cover of the book interesting, and I don't know whether you had any say in the cover or not, but for those who can't see it, and I don't know if I can show it, there is a drawing at the top of French Pasteurians in their laboratory, and that's from the late 19th century. And then in the bottom, there's a band of African students, apparently young African males in Cameroon in 1927, all looking through their microscopes, and I think is a nursing program. So I was wondering how you'd like us to read this cover, even if you didn't design it. Did Pastorians replicate themselves by training Africans and Asians? And finally, a third question. As with David Todd's recent book, A Velvet Empire, which some of those here today may have read, you add a comparative perspective. This is very useful because it highlights what it was distinctive about French imperialism as opposed to emphasizing what all modern European empires shared. In this case, you contrast the British preference for gargantuan centralized engineering projects with the Pastorians going small, as you call it, relying on existing infrastructure and the labor of administrators, soldiers, and local intermediaries to do their spectacular conquering of nature. So here's an easy question for you. How do you account for this difference? And are both these technological styles still present today? In other words, what are these the two legacies, if I can put it that way? So I'm going to stop there. I have more questions for you there, and there are questions beginning to come in from the chat. What would you like to do to take a stab at answering mine, or should we move on to a question in the chat?
Well, you had 3 questions, so maybe I'll just go through those, and then I think we've quite a bit of time, and I'll try to be brief in my answers too. So thank you, first of all, for this fantastic read and the question. Yeah, I mean, it is beyond bizarre and unfortunately very timely to have this book come out during COVID, and that has made me think very differently about a lot of the stuff I found in the archives, and appreciate a lot more the kind of fog of war that everybody is faced with in this moment of an unfolding epidemic, when you don't really have any knowledge about the disease you're facing or how the social and political consequences of the epidemic are going to play out. So you asked about vaccine hesitancy. It's, there are a couple of ways to answer it, and of course this depends tremendously on where you look. On the one hand, smallpox vaccination is quite common by this and well accepted and clearly effective. Smallpox is a terrible disease, so that's one strategy that the French can use to their advantage. And in fact, this is something that they do very consciously with the yellow fever vaccine, which they design in a way to be essentially indistinguishable from smallpox vaccination, administered via scarification, and in fact, sometimes bundled together with smallpox vaccination. And they don't really make a real effort to distinguish between the two vaccinations on their vaccination campaign. So it's quite likely that a lot of people who got the yellow fever vaccine didn't realize that they were getting it, thought they were getting a smallpox booster shot or something like that, or dose of the smallpox vaccine. And in any case, the process was similar enough that it was already familiar to a lot of people. Now, that said, there's and sometimes you can observe, I think, dynamics that we can observe today as well. During plague outbreaks, local elites, the Cambodian elites, for instance, are demanding vaccination from the French, basically saying, "Look, you put up these microbiological institutes. What are they doing now? We want to be the first in line to get vaccinated." At the same time, you also find a lot of vaccine hesitancy. Yeah, and I think the principal way in which this manifests is that people don't show up. If you look at the reports from the vaccination teams doing the yellow fever campaign from 1939 onwards, then very often, the stories are essentially, well, we asked people from this village to come to this place at this time, and we expected 60 people, and 10 showed up. So I think that tells you something about the level of vaccine hesitancy. And of course, it's completely understandable. This is inextricable from the relationship, the local French military and administrators have to those local population. So there's both vaccine hesitancy, but there's also, the vaccines carry a kind of a symbolic prestige that is also quite present in a lot of these. I really like the cover, and we went back and forth a lot with OUP on what exactly to put in the cover, and I think it turned out great, and I think it kind of points exactly to this ambivalence that you're suggesting. There's this question of did the Pastorians replicate themselves by training, a cadre of microbiologists in Africa and in Vietnam in sort of in their image. A different way to think about or to read this is, well, what are these trained microbiologists going to do with this knowledge, right? When we think of it as coming from Africa, rather than being imposed on Africa. And I think we see a lot of this dynamic happening in the book, where people do take up the language of bacteriology and turn it against the colonial state. Blaise Diagne, the African deputy, uses evidence from the yellow fever epidemic to basically tell the French, look, you guys have been racist in your public health policies all along. When we had an epidemic that predominantly affected Africans who lived in houses that were easily accessible to rats during the plague epidemic, then you had no trouble putting in place heavy curfews and burning down entire districts and basically policing your way through this thing. And now when you have the yellow fever epidemic, which disproportionately affects Europeans who don't have childhood immunity, you're kind of dragging your feet. And that's a very powerful argument. The French have a really hard time answering that one. So I think the cover also suggests that this image that the Pastorians want to tell about themselves, and that they want to tell about microbiology, which is that it's done by solid middle-class men with, well-trimmed beards and lab coats in, a well-funded laboratory in Paris, is actually not how a lot of microbiology happens. And it really happens, in these much less well-funded places, but the impact is done by people who don't look nothing like the Pastorian self-representation of themselves, but the impact it has is equally important. And then on the comparative dimension, I think every binary is a false binary, right? So the French had their own share of gargantuan projects, right? J.P. Dotton just wrote a book about one of them, the Congo Ocean Railway, and the British were doing their own share of microbiology. But I think one key difference here is that France in the 19th century really is the country of medical innovation, right? Very sort of self-consciously. The home to the hospital revolution in medicine, to advances in physiology, neurology, public health, you name it, and Pasteur, of course, is by the 1890s, a kind of a national saint. So I think that kind of reputation, which then is, which has its own valences in France, but then in the colonies gets transformed into this language of conquering the microbial world the same way we conquer the kind of the larger globe, is something that drives this. And the British don't have quite, they don't really have a Pasteur or that kind of well-defined, if constructed, legacy to rely on. So I think that's what's going on there.
Thanks, Aro. We have a cluster of questions. So I think what I might do is again, there are three here. I can read them out to you, and then you can also answer them in turn. The first one comes from Jess Pearson. Hi, Jess. She has a question that relates to the circulation of scientific research and the limitations of that circulation. Here, I'm speaking for Jess now. I've been struck recently at the lack of attention in the American press to some really interesting threads of COVID research. I'm thinking primarily about research coming out of places like Ghana and Italy on the possible inverse relationship between malaria, endemicity, and severe COVID. Can your book offer us any lessons about how scientific research circulates or does not that could help us understand what drives global research agendas in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? That's one question. A second question has to do with gender. This comes from, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce the name, Koam Hanak. And this question is, what role did gender play in your story? From female scientists like Pasteur's wife, or bureaucrats, or groups such as Catholic nuns in the medical world, etc. And if we have time, Judy Coffin would like to, and this was on my list too, just talk about the methodology that you use, or the methodological challenges of doing work on this scale. Thoughts you can share with others in this age of, as I say, where we're all supposed to be transnational and global, or try to be anyway.
Yeah, thank you. These are really excellent questions. So I'll start with, hi, Jess. Jess's question. What can we think about? How does the book help us think about what drives global research agendas? I mean, in the book, I sort of think of the circulation of these research agendas as being essentially strategic, right? It's not just kind of accidental that, Velmet begins his career in Saigon and then ends up then moves to Lille and then back to Paris and then ends up being, a big deal at the League of Nations Health Organization. Circulation is a way to move past different kinds of obstacles that come up in the process of pursuing a particular research project. So, take the yellow fever vaccine. This begins in West Africa with the 1928 outbreak, yellow fever, and this whole kind of hubbub about whether the French are being racist or not. That's spearheaded by Blaise Diagne. And the Pasteurians are essentially called in as a kind of diplomatic solution. Look, we all agree that these are the good guys, and we all agree that they're gonna. We can take their word. You don't have to take the word of the local health board. It's independent expert, right? And they start up this vaccine project, which they then move to New York because that's where the expertise is, where they can learn about how to replicate and cultivate the yellow fever virus in the brains of lab mice. And then they move to Paris, where their own laboratories are, but then they're not allowed to move to human trials because the director of the Presse Institute thinks it's too dangerous. There's a lot of criticism around them. There are a couple of sort of high-profile cases where people tracked yellow fever from vaccine candidates and end up in a really bad way. And in order to get around this criticism, they move to Tunis, where Charles Nicole, who's the competitor of Émile Rousse, working at the Tunis Pasteur Institute, basically says, look, I don't have these kinds of qualms about the safety of the vaccine. You can do your first human trial. So it's a series of strategic moves. You can do certain things in some places, and you can't do other things in other places. And one of the reasons why the colonial spaces have these kinds of strategic advantages is because they're less plugged into these international networks, these international scientific networks like the League of Nations Health Organization or the Society of Exotic Pathology. There are fewer people there who are observing the Pastorians, there is sort of fewer outside influence. So it's really a question of density in these sort of global networks of power. And the stuff that comes out of the less dense places kind of falls between the cracks, isn't noticed as much. The Pastorians get to control more of their own agenda. So to kind of come back to your point about what does this tell us about today, it really, these kinds of examples that you cite really help map, where the kind of dense nodes of power of today's sort of global health organizations are, the sort of global health infrastructure. And I can't exactly say that it's entirely surprising that Ghana is not a particularly dense node in that network. That's really unfortunate. Okay, Nuala's question about gender. That's a really great question as well. There are very few female actors in this story, and the Pasteur Institutes didn't exactly have like a lot of female scientists. I kept my eyes out for them. There is a really interesting story about masculinity to tell here, and this is sort of woven throughout the entire book, but there's a chapter where I kind of try to highlight it, which is that the way historians think of themselves as men changes as they move from metropole to colony, and they kind of reinvent the biography of Pasteur himself in doing so. If you look at how Parisian Pastorians talk about their own place in this masculine world and the place of Pasteur, then it's very much in the as kind of monks in a monastery. They're supposed to be detached from the goings on of the bustle of Parisian life, so that they can calm their passions and train their kind of objectivity to the problems at hand, and really come to certain knowledge, right, that isn't affected by emotion and passion. And that's not really how the colonial Pastorians think of themselves. They are swashbucklers. They are adventurers. Yersin, first thing he does when he gets to Indochina is he goes on this expedition to the mountains where he, fights pirates and, saves people from certain doom, and writes a 19-part story about it that's published in a geography journal in Paris. And that's a part of him establishing himself as a credible colonialist, essentially, because he's going to have to move in very different circles than Parisian Pastorians. He's going to have to hobnob with colonial administrators and businessmen, who, all are kind of enraptured by this heroes of empire vibe that Ed Berenson has described in his book. So the gender aspects of the story matter greatly. It also causes a lot of tension between colonial Pastorians and metropolitan Pastorians. And this is, for instance, how we get to this conflict between Émile Roux and Charles Nicolle, who, is willing to go to lengths in human trials that Roux not. So that's a really great question. Thanks for that. And finally, I realize I'm going on for way too long. To answer Judy's question about methodology, then this was it was a huge challenge, and I thought on many occasions that maybe I should have just, done only yellow fever, right? Or maybe I should have just done only West Africa. But I think, combining, essentially what I was trying to do was to take the best of transnational history that really sort of thinks about movements between spaces and comparisons. J.P. Dotton's first book, An Empire Divided, was a huge, excellent model for that. And Ruth Rogaski's book on Tianjin was another good model for that. And I sort of thought, okay, well, what if we take this and then try to take the best that STS has to offer with these really nitty-gritty analyses of what's going on in a single laboratory, in the development of, like, for instance, in discussions over how exactly should a vaccine be titrated, or what kind of delivery mechanism, and try to kind of blend them together. And the cost of that essentially was to leave out a lot of stuff that has to do with the history of biomedicine, and these diseases, that simply did not, cross the paths of these specifically historian microbiologists. So the book doesn't really have a lot on vernacular medicine in Indochina or Africa or other medical traditions, or even, French naval medicine. These are all medical traditions that are present, that are incredibly influential and are sort of operating on, and often intersecting too with historians. But, this is just the kind of cost benefit analysis that I was going through. And I really wanted to show the impact of the circulation of this one tradition. So I had to focus on that at the expense of the others.
Thank you, Aro, for really very illuminating answers. And we're running out of time, but I just and please, if anyone, we probably can take one more if anyone has a question that they'd like to pose in the chat. And while we're waiting, I wanted to sort of follow up on that last question about audience for your book, because those of us who've done any kind of work at the intersection of empire and history of science, and these are very different fields, and trying to bridge them is both, essential, because we all need to know this history. Science rules our lives, and we also aren't necessarily trained to do it. So I'm just curious whether this has been out almost 2 years, whether you've had any response from the historians of science as well as historians of, of empire.
Yeah, I've actually been really pleasantly surprised by how warmly it's been received by historians of science. And I think, a lot of the talks I've done on it and a lot of the invitations I've gotten have been from, groups in the history of medicine or history of science. I did a talk at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine during COVID. So it's at least it's been my sense that it speaks to both audiences, which I was hoping that it would, but I was also very conscious that I was definitely approaching this topic, as let's say a historian of colonialism, a French historian, who's interested in this medical dimension rather than, someone who's really trained in the history of medicine and the history of science. And I think that would have been a very, very different book with some very different questions. Because, like at the heart of it, the history of microbiology is really fascinating to me, but at the heart of the book are questions about, politics and power, as you say. So less sort of questions about epistemology and, disease definitions and loads of questions that, one could write many other books about, and people have.
Well, we're right at the 4:00 and time out, and I think I don't see any more questions in the chat. So maybe we should end on that sort of actually very positive note that you've written a model monograph for those who want to actually be both transnational and transdisciplinary, if that's the right word. So really kudos to you, Aro. And we've got you. Do we have time for one more, or are you going off? Nuala wanted to just know if there were stories that didn't make the book.
Millions.
Stories that
so
made
many
you
stories.
laugh and that horrified you. So I'm sure, right? Well, maybe we best save that for for private exchange and we'll just thank Aro again for taking the time to share his work with us, and Judy and Sally for hosting this really wonderful session. Thank you, everybody, for coming.